Hello, a warm welcome to my YouTube today. We're going to take a look at the short Sunderland. Its purpose that it was designed for, both pre-war and post-war, and its activities during the Second World War. And towards the end of the film we're going to take a look at the journey that it took from the UK in 1993 with Kermit Weeks over to the States. At the start of World War II, RAF Coastal Command was changing over from the short Singapore to the new short Sunderland for its maritime patrols. The aircraft was a direct derivative of the civil short Empire seaplanes of Imperial Airways. They were large aircraft which were to play an important role in the combat against, for instance, the German U-boats. The Sunderlands were a formidable gun platform, of which the defensive capabilities were gradually increased during the war to such an extent that it really brought fear to U-boat commanders as well as to attacking German air crews. The latter was called respectfully, they called it Das Fliegen Stachelschwein, or the flying porcupine. Pardon my German phraseology. During the Second World War, RAF Mount Batten was the home to No. 10 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, and those now deserted hangars hummed with activity as they serviced the needs of the squadron's aircraft. Sunderland flying boats, named after Admiral Batten, a Civil War governor of the headland and the tower, and the history of Mount Batten. During the early 30s, life at Mount Batten was pleasant and peaceful. The training flights and the odd cruise to the continent or the Mediterranean relieved the boredom. However, as the war in Europe became increasingly apparent, 204 Squadron were re-equipped with Mount Batten's first Sunderlands in 1939 and soon became responsible for patrolling the western approaches where, if hostilities broke out, they would once more hunt down the U-boats in one of their favourite killing grounds. In April 1940, 204 Squadron moved to Sunderland in the Shetlands, and the Australians moved in the shape of 10 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force. They were to stay for the rest of the war, hunting submarines, with a brief departure to Wales during the height of the Plymouth Blitz. This made life impossible for Sunderland crews, who, with Plymouth Sound so jammed with shipping, could hardly take off without hitting either wandering merchant ships or naval craft rushing around the Sound, and trying to avoid being strafed by enemy planes. As the war ended, many of the squadron's Australian personnel were repatriated, and on the 5th of November 1945, 10 Squadron left for good, and Mount Batten was transferred from Coastal Command to Maintenance Command, and it was the end of the flying days at RAF Mount Batten Boat Station. The Sunderland Mark I was propelled by the same engines as the prototype. The first aircraft were delivered to the RAF in the summer of 1938, replacing the short Singapores of No. 230 Squadron in Singapore and No. 210 Squadron at Pembroke, England. At the outbreak of the war in September 1939, another 2 squadrons had switched to the Sunderland, followed by another 3 during the first few months of the war. The Australian Air Force ordered 9 planes, but they designated them A-18, and on September the 11th, 1939, No. 10 Royal Australian Air Force Squadron, stationed in England, received its first plane, and then 461 Squadron, also stationed in England a short time later. The development of the Sunderland was a direct descendant of the short Empire C-class seaplanes of the 1930s. A flying boat was developed under the factory designation S-25, which could, based on the experience with the Empire aircraft, count on an immediate order of 21 units in March 1936. In 1933, the Air Ministry had issued Specification R233, inviting Short and Saunders Roe to construct 2 prototypes. Short was the only company which managed to complete a prototype on time, and the design was directly derived from the short Empires. Naturally, for military purposes, a number of adaptations had to be made, Nose and tail constructions were adapted in order to accommodate an automatic gun turret. This meant the cockpit had to be moved further to the back. The hull was adapted to the altered construction, and in order to compensate for the weight of the tail turret, the wings were slightly V-shaped. The hull had been split in two decks, with the bomb bay situated on the upper deck. In order to enable the bombs to be dropped, rails were fitted on both sides of the fuselage beneath the wings. Bombs, depth charges or mines were shoved out of these rails and then dropped. For its defence, a twin-gunned Fraser-Nash turret was fitted in the nose. The tail turret contained 4 machine guns, and there was a position for a handheld machine gun on each side of the upper hull. The first prototype, K4774, made its maiden flight on October the 16th, 1937. It was not an outright success. The engines used were the Bristol Pegasus XC, an older model that had been intended in the design of another aircraft. After modifications, the prototype was propelled by 4 Bristol Pegasus 22 engines of 1,010 horsepower each. This aircraft turned out to be a magnificent performer. It was 31 years ago, almost to the day, that the last Sunderland flying boat was about to leave the UK. It was formerly owned by Edward Hulton, and he knew he was throwing money down the drain in keeping the short Sunderland Golf Bravo Juliet Hotel Sierra flying, but he wasn't about to throw away his dream. And it's 31 years ago, almost to the day, that Sunderland left the UK bound for the United States of America. Edward Hulton was the heir to the Hulton Picture Library empire, and he worked wonders to keep this his pride and joy flying. He did so in the face of considerable and seemingly never-ending challenges. Given the circumstances, it's remarkable that Golf Bravo Juliet Hotel Sierra was kept running as long as it was. Eventually, after some years of struggling, some aerial displays and a few aborted trips to Ireland to enter into a deal with Ryanair, Edward Hulton entered the Sunderland into Sotheby's auction on the 24th of September 1991. It had made a couple of recent flights, and it was reported to be in tip-top condition, but in a time of recession, achieving the 450,000 to 500,000 catalogue estimate was always going to be a tall order. Sure enough, bidding ceased at 320,000, and the Sunderland was left unsold. There was a local sortie on the 23rd of October, which turned out to be the aircraft's last flight under Edward Hulton's ownership. American collector Kermit Weeks was, of course, its saviour. His February 1993 acquisition of the flying boat meant it would leave British shores but find a permanent home in the US of A. The Sunderland was prepared for a transatlantic flight, and on the 7th of July 1993 it took to the air again, twice. Weeks joining the pilot Emmett on the flight deck. 5 tests and training sorties were undertaken from Calshot between then and the 16th, the last concentrating on the all-important fuel system checks. With that, all was set. The objective was Oshkosh, and the pride of place at the EAA AirVenture event. Departure had been due on the 19th of July, but a domestic issue for one of the crew put it back until the 20th. The send-off from Calshot was tremendous, with family, friends, well-wishers, old associates at the loss from the UK of such a famous aircraft. With a certain amount of difficulty, we managed to extract ourselves from the many TV, radio, newspaper and magazine reporters, and the aircraft departed, probably for the last time, from Southampton Water. Naturally, a flypast was the next thing, to say thank you to all those interested people lining the shore and the jetty at Calshot. The Sunderland, once it was in the US of A, was re-registered November 814 Mike Lima. It hasn't flown very often since heading stateside, having spent a few years at a lake at Winnebago, while a seaplane ramp was built at Kermit Weeks' Fantasy of Flight attraction in Florida. It enjoyed a rare outing in 1996. The short Sunderland remains with Kermit Weeks at the Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida. There hasn't been any recent activity with regard to this aircraft, but fingers crossed, sometime in the future, the Sunderland may well take to the air again. Some interesting facts about the Sunderland Mark V that Kermit Weeks owns. It was built in 1944. It has a wingspan of 112 feet, a cruise speed of 150 miles per hour, and a gross weight of 57,000 pounds. It has 4 Pratt Whitney R-1830 engines, which produce 1,200 horsepower each. Armament is 10 7.7mm machine guns, 2 12.7mm machine guns, and 4,960 pounds of mines, bombs or depth charges. And as already has been mentioned, because of the many guns protruding from the aircraft, the Germans had dubbed this short Sunderland the Flying Porcupine. Early Sunderlands were powered with the Bristol Pegasus sleeve valve engines. Unbelievably, for an aircraft with this amount of endurance, over 16 hours, they were not equipped with feathering propellers. The British had been flying the American PBY Catalina flying boats and were very satisfied with their Pratt Whitney engines. Because of the engine's feathering propellers and extra horsepower, the decision was made to incorporate them on the Sunderlands, beginning with the production of the Sunderland Mark V earlier aircraft. They were flown back to the factory in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and upgraded. The new power plants were essentially right off the PBY, cowlings and all. As it turned out, it was the Sunderland crews that suggested that the Pegasus engines could be replaced by a Pratt Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp 2-row air-cooled radial engine. The 14-cylinder twin Wasps provided 1,200 horsepower each, and they were in use on the RAF Catalinas and the Dakotas, making logistics and maintenance straightforward. 2 Mark IIIs then taken off production lines in early 1944 and fitted with the American engines. I thank you very much for watching along. Really hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one. All the very best. Cheers for now. Take care.